The June sun of 1918 hung heavy over the golden wheat fields of northern France, illuminating a landscape that was about to be irrevocably scarred by history. To the casual observer, the terrain near the Paris-Metz road might have seemed pastoral, a quiet stretch of European countryside. However, the air told a different story. It was thick with the acrid stench of gunpowder, the metallic tang of blood, and the suffocating odor of death. It was here, amidst the swaying grain and the dark, foreboding tree line, that a transformation took place, not just of the map of the Western Front, but of the very soul of the United States military. When the first waves of United States Marines rose from the earth to advance, they did not step merely into a firefight, they stepped into a crucible. As they moved forward, the German machine guns, positioned with lethal precision, began their rhythmic, mechanical slaughter. The lines of advancing Americans were cut down like ripe wheat before a scythe. Yet the lines did not break. The momentum did not falter. Against all tactical logic and human instinct, the survivors pressed on. They climbed into the hell that was Belleau Wood, a dense, tangled forest where every step became a brutal, close-quarters battle and every breath felt like a final prayer. Out of this bloody chaos, a myth was born that would alter the face of American infantry forever. It was in this crucible, in June 1918, that the United States Marine Corps earned a moniker that would follow them through history, a title that would become synonymous with their identity for the next century and beyond. Teufelhunden, the Devil Dogs. The scale of the legend of the Devil Dogs cannot be overstated, nor can its importance to the heritage of the Corps. According to the official lore that has been passed down through generations of Marines, it was the Germans themselves who bestowed this title. It is said that the veteran German soldiers, men who had survived 4 years of the most horrific trench warfare in human history, were so stunned by the ferocity, the tenacity, and the sheer relentless aggression of these American newcomers that they could only liken them to hounds from hell. The nickname was not born of mockery, but of a fearful respect found in the eyes of an enemy who had expected to face amateurs and instead found themselves locking bayonets with demons. However, the legend of Belleau Wood is built on a foundation much grimmer than just a fearsome nickname. The birth of this legend came at a staggering price, a cost in blood that the American public and the Marine Corps itself was scarcely prepared to comprehend. The sheer brutality of the engagement is best illustrated by a single chilling statistical fact. In this one battle, the casualties sustained by the Marines exceeded the total combined losses of the Marine Corps for its entire history up to that point. For 143 years, from the halls of Montezuma to the suppression of the Boxer Rebellion, the Corps had fought in small wars and skirmishes across the globe. Yet the industrial slaughter of Belleau Wood eclipsed a century and a half of warfare in a matter of weeks. This was the moment the Marine Corps ceased to be merely a constabulary force of ship detachments and colonial infantry and was forged into a premier shock troop of modern warfare. The battle marked a violent transition from the romanticized era of the 19th century to the mechanized horrors of the 20th. The genesis of the Devil Dog legend as it stands today is a complex tapestry woven from a mixture of visceral reality, wartime newspaper propaganda, and the American myth-making machine. While the moniker Teufelhunden is popularly attributed to the German High Command or terrified frontline soldiers, historical reality suggests a more nuanced origin involving American war correspondents and a public hungry for heroes. Yet the origin of the word matters less than the spirit it captured. Whether coined by a German officer in a trench or a journalist at a typewriter, the name stuck because it rang true. It described the reality of what occurred in those dark woods. The artistic image of that June remains seared in the collective memory of the Corps. The contrast between the summer sun and the darkness of the woods, The waves of young men, many of them college students and athletes, walking into the face of machine gun fire with a stoicism that unnerved their enemies. They crawled into a forest where visibility was measured in feet, where death came from unseen angles, and where the fighting devolved into a primal struggle of bayonets and fists. Belleau Wood was the turning point. It was the anvil on which the modern Marine Corps was hammered into shape. The legend of the Devil Dogs is not merely a story of a battle won, it is the story of an identity forged in fire. It explains why, a century later, the title remains a symbol of unfaltering courage and aggressive spirit. It serves as the opening chapter of the modern American military tradition, proving that in the darkest of forests, against the most insurmountable odds, the only way out was through. This article traces that birth, from the desperation of the French retreat to the final bloody triumph, and dissects how a single month in 1918 created a legacy that would echo for eternity. By the spring of 1918, the Great War had ground the nations of Europe into a bloody stalemate that had lasted 4 agonizing years. However, the static nature of the conflict was about to be shattered by a sudden, terrifying fluidity. On May 27, 1918, General Erich Ludendorff, the mastermind behind the German war effort, unleashed Operation Blücher. It was destined to be the last major German offensive of the war, a final desperate roll of the iron dice intended to break the Allied resolve before American manpower could fully tip the scales. The operation began with a ferocity that stunned the Allied commanders. In the sector of the Chemin des Dames, the German stormtroopers, utilizing new infiltration tactics, smashed through the French lines with terrifying efficiency. The scale of the breakthrough was unprecedented in the context of trench warfare. In a single day, just 24 hours, German forces advanced more than 13 miles. For soldiers accustomed to measuring gains in yards of muddy soil paid for with thousands of lives, a 13-mile advance was not just a defeat, it was a catastrophe. It was one of the longest single-day advances seen in World War I. A thunder that echoed all the way to the streets of Paris. The German juggernaut crossed the Vesle River, their sights set firmly on the strategic railway hub at Compiègne. The capture of this sector would sever vital supply lines and potentially open the road to the French capital. However, the true genius and the ultimate tragedy of the German plan lay in its original intent. Officially, the goal of Operation Blücher was diversionary. Ludendorff's primary objective was to smash the British forces in Flanders to the north. By launching a massive assault toward Paris, he intended to panic the French High Command, forcing them to strip their reserves from the British sector to save their capital. Once the French reserves were committed south, however, Ludendorff planned to deliver the death blow to the British in the north. The plan worked too well. The German tactical success was so overwhelming, the French collapse so sudden, that the diversion threatened to become the main event. The panic in Paris was palpable and impossible to conceal. The thunder of German artillery could be heard in the distance, a constant reminder of the encroaching doom. The French government, fearing a repeat of 1870 or 1914, began making quiet preparations for evacuation. The City of Light was on the verge of going dark. Amidst this crumbling defense, Supreme Allied Commander Ferdinand Foch maintained a cold, calculating view of the strategic reality. He understood that despite the terror of the rapid advance, the Germans were facing a looming logistical collapse. They were extending their supply lines beyond the breaking point. They were exhausted, hungry, and bleeding manpower they could not replace. Foch knew that a breakthrough to Paris was strategically unlikely due to these logistical constraints, but he also knew that wars are often decided by morale as much as by logistics. If the French army broke, if Paris fell into hysteria, the war could be lost regardless of the supply trucks failing to reach the German front. The line had to hold.
It was into this breach, into this atmosphere of impending doom and exhausted resignation that the Americans arrived. By June 1st, the U.S. 2nd Division moved to the front lines. Embedded within this division was the 4th Marine Brigade, a force of approximately 8,500 Marines, comprised of the 5th and 6th Regiments. They marched toward the sound of the guns, moving against the tide of refugees and retreating French soldiers. To the weary French poilus, who had borne the brunt of the war for 4 years, these Americans were an anomaly. They were fresh, well-fed, and physically imposing. More importantly, they possessed a naive but potent confidence that the battered Europeans had lost years ago. The arrival of the Marines was not just a reinforcement of numbers, it was an injection of spirit. However, the reputation that preceded them was already being crafted by forces far away from the battlefield. While the Marines were preparing to shed blood to earn their place in history, the American propaganda machine was already churning. A peculiar and revealing fact illuminates the construction of the Devil Dog legend during this period. In April 1918, a full 6 weeks before the Battle of Belleau Wood would begin, the Boston Globe newspaper had already published an article mentioning the nickname Teufelhunden in reference to the Marines. The newspaper claimed that the enemy had already bestowed this title upon them. This chronology is telling. It suggests that the moniker was, at least in part, a pre-packaged piece of propaganda, a narrative prepared in advance to bolster support at home and intimidate the enemy abroad. The legend was already written. Now the Marines had to live up to it. As the German offensive stalled due to exhaustion and the arrival of fresh Allied troops, the stage was set for a collision that would turn the Teufelhunden from a newspaper catchphrase into a blood-soaked reality. The specific geography of the coming fight was narrowing down to a hunting preserve of the French aristocracy, a small forest that would soon be known to the world. Secretary of the Navy Josephus Daniels would later encapsulate the magnitude of what was about to happen with a reverence that stripped away the politics and left only the raw heroism of the moment. Looking back on the events that were set in motion in that spring of 1918, he stated, "In the history of the Marine Corps, there has never been such a battle as that in Belleau Wood. Fighting day and night without rest, without sleep, often without water, and for days without hot rations, the Marines met and defeated the best divisions that Germany could throw into the line." But before the best divisions of Germany would clash with the untested Americans, the strategic board had to be reset. By early June, the Germans had pushed as far as they could. The momentum of Operation Blucher was waning, but they held the ground. They occupied the woods. They established their machine gun nests among the rocks and the trees. They waited. The thunder in Germany had rolled across France and stopped at the edge of a wheat field, waiting for the lightning that the U.S. Marines were about to bring. The psychological and physical components of the coming storm were now in place. The French were desperate, the Germans were overextended but dug in, and the Americans were arriving with a myth to fulfill and a battle to win.
Long before the first American boot touched the soil of France, the United States Marine Corps had already carved out a distinct and formidable identity. To the European powers, the American military was often viewed as an unknown quantity, a sleeping giant with vast industrial potential but questionable combat experience in modern warfare. However, those who paid close attention knew that the Marine Corps was different. They were not a conscript army raised in haste. They were a force forged in the fires of the small wars, possessing a unique culture of combat mastery that made them an elite shock force long before they arrived at Belleau Wood. By 1918, the Corps had established a reputation as a relentless, multi-purpose infantry, tested time and again in the farthest corners of the globe. Their battle honors were not abstract concepts, but hard-won realities from the jungles of the Philippines to the dusty streets of Mexico. They had fought in the Spanish-American War, suppressed the Boxer Rebellion in China in 1900,
and conducted expeditionary operations in Haiti. These conflicts, though smaller in scale than the industrial slaughter of the Western Front, had honed the Marines into a sharp, professional instrument of war. They were accustomed to being outnumbered, operating in hostile territory, and relying on superior discipline and aggression to secure victory. The composition of the Marines arriving in France reflected a unique blend of hardened veterans and high-quality volunteers. The 5th Marine Regiment, in particular, boasted a demographic profile that was strikingly different from the average infantry unit of the era. By 1918, approximately 60% of the regiment consisted of college students, including a significant number of professional-level athletes. These were young men of education and supreme physical fitness, drawn to the Corps by its reputation for toughness. They brought with them an athletic, competitive spirit and an intellectual capacity that allowed them to adapt quickly to the rigors of war. They were not just soldiers, they were soldiers of the sea, a volunteer force that prided itself on being the first to fight. Central to this reputation was a deep-seated culture of individual combat prowess, specifically in marksmanship. In the European trenches, the machine gun and the artillery shell had become the gods of war, with individual rifle fire often relegated to a secondary role of massed volleys. The Marines, however, religiously adhered to the doctrine of the rifleman. Training with the Springfield M1903, a bolt-action rifle known for its accuracy, was not merely a drill, it was a way of life. The standard of marksmanship within the Corps was legendary. Every Marine, regardless of rank or specialty, was a rifleman first. Their training emphasized precision fire at long distances, a skill that many European armies had neglected in favor of volume of fire. This obsession with accuracy would soon come as a lethal shock to the German forces. German observers and survivors would later note with dismay that Marines were effectively engaging targets with aimed fire from distances of over 100 yards, a feat considered exceptionally rare and unexpected in the chaotic environment of the Western Front. This was not the spray-and-pray tactic of panicked conscripts, it was the calculated lethality of hunters. A later German intelligence report would capture the essence of this new threat, observing, "The Marines are vigorous, self-confident, and remarkable marksmen. They represent a threat of a completely new scale." This culture of excellence was personified and instilled by the living legends who walked among the ranks. The leadership of the Marines in 1918 was defined by men who were not just officers and NCOs, but mythic figures in their own right. Two names stood above the rest, embodying the spirit of the Corps: Dan Daly and Smedley Butler. These two men held a distinction unmatched in the annals of American military history. They were the only two servicemen to ever receive 2 Medals of Honor for 2 separate, distinct combat operations. Dan Daly had earned his first Medal of Honor during the Boxer Rebellion in 1900, defending the legation walls in Beijing, and his second in Haiti in 1915. Their presence in the Corps was not just symbolic, it was functional. Dan Daly in particular served as a tangible link between the old Corps of the 19th century and the modern force preparing for France. Serving as a drill instructor, Daly used his immense experience to harden the new recruits. He did not teach from a manual alone. He taught by personal example. He instilled a philosophy of unconditional obedience to orders and a stoic readiness to face death. To the young college students and athletes of the 5th and 6th Regiments, Daly was the physical manifestation of military professionalism. He taught them that being a Marine meant possessing a brotherhood of the damned mentality, a willingness to go where others would not, and to stand firm when others would run. Thus, when the 4th Marine Brigade prepared to enter the European theater, They were not a ragged collection of draftees. They were a weapon that had been sharpening itself for decades. They possessed a unique esprit de corps, a terrifying proficiency with their rifles, and leaders who had already walked through the fires of hell and returned. The Germans expected another wave of inexperienced Americans. What they were about to face was an elite volunteer force that had been culturally and physically engineered for the very moment of contact. The soldiers of the sea were ready to step onto the land and prove that their reputation was not merely a story, but a warning.
By mid-March 1918, the 4th Marine Brigade had settled into a deceptive rhythm. Stationed in a relatively quiet sector southeast of Verdun, the Marines were introduced to the realities of trench warfare in a low-intensity environment. It was a place of mud, rats, and occasional artillery fire, but it lacked the apocalyptic fury that defined the major offensives of the Western Front. For a brief moment, it seemed as though their introduction to the Great War would be gradual. However, the strategic situation in Europe was collapsing, and the luxury of a gradual acclimatization was about to be violently stripped away. On May 9, the brigade received orders that would alter their destiny. They were to be redeployed to a new sector, roughly 40 miles northwest of Paris. The gravity of the situation became undeniably clear by late May. The German lines were expanding like a cancer, and the French defenses were buckling. On May 31, the call came not just for deployment, but for salvation. The regiment executed a forced march to close a critical breach in the crumbling French line. Time was the enemy as much as the Germans were. The movement, which required mobilizing thousands of men and tons of equipment, was executed with a desperate urgency, taking only a few hours to bring the Marines from reserve to the razor's edge of the collapse. The march itself was a surreal journey into the heart of a national tragedy. Marching under the relentless glare of the June sun, the Marines moved against the tide of humanity. As they advanced toward the front in open-bed trucks and on foot, they passed through a landscape of despair. They saw villages that had been hollowed out by shelling, fields that had been churned into mud, and the heartbreaking spectacle of the French retreat. Refugees clogged the roads, their faces etched with the panic of those fleeing an unstoppable force. Intermingled with the civilians were retreating French soldiers, exhausted and demoralized, telling tales of a German army that could not be halted. In stark contrast to this chaotic exodus, the young Marines pressed forward with a demeanor that bordered on the ceremonial. Officers understood the tactical nightmare awaiting them. They knew they were heading toward a collision with elite German shock troops who had already shattered the veteran French divisions. Yet the rank and file, young men who, for the most part, had never seen the true face of industrial slaughter, maintained a calm, almost solemn discipline. They did not boast, nor did they falter. There was a collective understanding that they were walking into history. They witnessed the dust and the heat and the smell of fear from the retreating crowds, and they responded by simply tightening their grip on their rifles and marching on. A French officer, watching this column of green uniforms moving against the stream of blue-clad French retreaters, was struck by the visual and spiritual contrast he witnessed. He later remarked on the phenomenon he witnessed. New life, youth, fresh energy came to save exhausted France. It was not just troops arriving, it was hope. However, the reality of the front line was immediate and brutal. Upon arriving on June 1st and June 2nd, there was no time for orientation. The Marines were thrown directly into the fire to stem the German tide. Over those first 48 hours, the 4th Marine Brigade repelled a series of ferocious German assaults. 3 distinct waves of German infantry crashed against the Marine lines, attempting to exploit the momentum of their previous successes. Each time the Marines held. They stopped the advance cold, utilizing their marksmanship to break the German formations before they could overrun the position. But this initial success exacted a heavy toll.
In just 2 days of defensive fighting, Marine casualties soared to over 1,000 men. It was a staggering number, more than the commanders had anticipated, and a grim foreshadowing of the attrition to come. The shock of these losses might have broken a less disciplined unit, but the Marines absorbed the blow and remained in place. The fragility of the situation led to a conflict in command philosophy. The French command, reeling from weeks of defeat and wary of further breakthroughs, advised the Americans to fall back. They wanted the Marines to dig in further to the rear, establishing a defensive line that would be easier to hold. It was a prudent, traditional military calculation. General James Herbert, commanding the Marine Brigade, rejected this prudence. In a decision that would define the ethos of the battle, he issued a counter-order that left no room for interpretation. Hold where they stand. There would be no retreat. There would be no digging in at the rear. The Marines were to hold the line exactly where they were, in the shallow foxholes and hastily dug pits they had carved out of the French soil. The physical toll on the men was immense. They were operating on little sleep, fueled only by adrenaline and discipline. An engineer captain, observing the relentless activity of the Marines during this critical window, encapsulated the awe and pity felt by those who watched them work. Boys, they dig trenches and mend roads all night and then fight all day. By the evening of June 2nd, the line had stabilized, but the atmosphere had changed. The quiet sector was a distant memory. The Marines were now the cork in the bottle, the only thing standing between the German advance and the open road to Paris. They had marched through the wreckage of a retreating army, ignored the panic of a collapsing nation, and planted their feet in the earth with a refusal to move. The defensive phase was concluding, but the true test, the dark, fortified forest of Belleau Wood that loomed ahead, was waiting. The march was over. The legend was about to begin.
As the Marines dug into the shallow earth, peering across the wheat fields toward the dark, menacing silhouette of the tree line, a critical question hung in the stagnant summer air. Who was waiting for them in the shadows? To understand the carnage that was about to unfold, one must look at the disposition of the German forces, a mix of exhausted veterans, calculated defensive genius, and a dangerous underestimation of their new adversary. The occupants of Belleau Wood were the German 237th Division. In the rigid hierarchy of the Imperial German Army, the 237th was classified as a trench division rather than a storm division. They were rated as 4th class, a designation that implies mediocrity only to the uninitiated. While they were not the elite shock troops trained for the high-speed maneuvers of the initial offensive, they were nonetheless a formidable defensive entity. Comprising roughly 10,000 men, the division was tired, depleted by years of war, and ill-equipped for mobile combat in open terrain. However, fate had handed them a position that negated their weaknesses and maximized their lethality: the forest itself. Belleau Wood was not merely a cluster of trees, it was a natural fortress. Originally maintained as a hunting preserve for the French aristocracy, the wood was a dense, tangled nightmare of nature. The canopy was thick, blotting out the sun and creating a perpetual gloom on the forest floor. Visibility was often reduced to a claustrophobic 15 to 20 feet. Beneath the trees, the ground was a chaotic jumble of thick underbrush, ravines, and massive rock formations. These rocky outcroppings, scattered throughout the woods, created natural defensive bastions reminiscent of the Devil's Den at the Battle of Gettysburg. The Germans had utilized every inch of this terrain to construct a kill zone. The 237th Division had established a network of mutually supporting machine gun positions. Maxim machine guns were nestled behind rocks, buried in the undergrowth, and positioned to cover every approach. The German gunners knew every bush, every stone, and every potential avenue of advance.
They had created interlocking fields of fire, ensuring that any force attempting to penetrate the wood would be subjected to crossfire from invisible enemies. It was a defensive setup designed to bleed an attacker dry, transforming the hunting preserve into an abattoir. Commanding this formidable defense were officers hardened by conflicts far removed from the French countryside. Lieutenant General von Jacobi, commanding the 237th Division, was an experienced officer with a background in German administration in Africa. Beneath him, commanding the 461st Regiment directly in the path of the Marines, was Major Bischoff. A veteran of Germany's colonial wars, Bischoff was a man of distinct temperament. While some sources suggest he was supremely confident in his position, others hint at a brittle determination, a stubbornness born of the knowledge that there was nowhere left to retreat. These leaders brought a ruthless pragmatism to the defense. They were not fighting for glory, but for survival and the retention of the strategic foothold they had seized. Perhaps the most dangerous weapon in the German arsenal, however, was their perception of the enemy. The German intelligence services had identified the opposing troops as Americans. To the German High Command, this was significant, but not necessarily terrifying. The Americans were viewed as the newcomers, amateurs in a war of professionals. The Germans knew that this was the first full-scale engagement for U.S. forces. They banked on American inexperience, expecting them to make the tactical errors of green troops. This expectation created a paradox. The Germans anticipated resistance, yet they could not comprehend the scale of the ferocity that was about to be unleashed upon them. The stakes, however, were crystal clear to the German leadership. They understood that this battle was about more than just a patch of woods. It was a test of national will. A German order issued on June 8, 1918, by the commander of the neighboring 28th Division perfectly encapsulated the geopolitical anxiety that permeated the German lines. If the Americans achieve success on our front, even temporarily, it could have the most unfavorable influence on the mood of the Entente and the duration of the war. The question is whether the Anglo-American propaganda will claim that the American army is equal or superior to the German army. This fear was compounded by a chilling piece of internal analysis. A German staff officer had commissioned a detailed study of American combat potential. The conclusion was alarming. Based on the current rate of development and the physical quality of the troops, if the Americans were allowed to learn the art of war, they would evolve into a threat of a completely new magnitude. The report suggested that the Americans possessed a raw potential that, if refined, could overwhelm the depleted German ranks. So the German strategy at Belleau Wood was driven by a desperate necessity. They had to crush the Americans here and now. They had to prove that the doughboys were inferior, to break their morale before they could become the threat of a completely new scale predicted by the analysts. As the sun began to lower on June 6th, the soldiers of the 237th Division checked their ammunition belts and peered through the gloom of the forest. They were waiting for the amateurs. They were waiting to teach a lesson in modern warfare. They had no idea that the students coming across the wheat field had no intention of learning. They were coming to dismantle the school. The clock ticked toward late afternoon. It was 17:45 local time, 16:45 by German reckoning, on June 6, 1918. The sun was beginning its slow descent, casting long golden shadows across the wheat fields that separated the American lines from the dark, fortified tree line of Belleau Wood. Inside those woods, the German defenders waited, their fingers on the triggers of Maxim machine guns, their optics trained on the open ground. Outside, approximately 10,000 Marines prepared to do the unthinkable. What followed was not merely a battle. It was a collision of 19th century tactics against 20th century industrial weaponry. a tragic and heroic assault that would stain the wheat red and etch this date into history forever. The tactical orchestration of the attack was dictated not by the Marines, but by the French Corps commander, General Jean Degout. In a decision that would have catastrophic consequences, Degout ordered the attack to proceed en echelon, in waves. The plan called for the assault to unfold gradually, sweeping from left to right. While this was a traditional French maneuver intended to ripple across the front, in the face of entrenched automatic weapons, it was a death sentence. The staggered timing allowed the German gunners to shift their focus, concentrating their devastating fire on each successive wave of Marines as they rose to advance. When the whistle blew, the Marines stepped off. They did not advance in the small, dispersed stormtrooper groups that had become the standard for survival on the Western Front. Instead, they moved in classic, rigid combat formations, dense chains of men, aligned in neat rows, with supporting waves following closely behind. This was the tactic they had been drilled in, the doctrine of open warfare they had brought from America. To the German observers peering through the trees, the sight was baffling. One German officer would later record his astonishment, noting that while the Germans would have advanced in loose, erratic clusters to minimize casualties, the Americans came on in thick, synchronized lines, perfect targets for the machine guns. As the first wave entered the wheat field, the German positions erupted. The air turned into a supersonic storm of lead. The golden wheat, waist-high and swaying in the summer breeze, suddenly exploded with geysers of dirt and blood. The discipline of the Marines, so carefully cultivated on the parade grounds, now resulted in a horrifying spectacle. Men fell in droves, cut down like the wheat surrounding them. Entire squads were erased in the blink of an eye. Yet the momentum did not cease. The survivors did not break. They closed the gaps in their lines and kept walking. The Germans, accustomed to enemies who would dive for cover or retreat under such withering fire, were witnessing something they could not comprehend. Waves of men who seemed to ignore the very existence of death. Embedded within this chaotic advance was Floyd Gibbons, a war correspondent for the Chicago Tribune. Gibbons was not an observer from the safety of the rear echelon. He was one of the 36 accredited correspondents who chose to walk into the fire alongside the infantry. He wanted to see the war from the perspective of the men fighting it, and on this day, he got closer to the reality of combat than he had ever intended. Gibbons advanced into the wheat field, moving with the Marines into the teeth of the German defense. As the fire intensified, he found himself pinned down, hugging the earth in a desperate attempt to avoid the swarm of bullets buzzing overhead. In a dispatch that would later become famous, he described the terrifying intimacy of the moment. "I am lying before me, and the only way to get closer to the ground is to unbutton my uniform." But the war did not spare the observer. A machine gun bullet struck Gibbons, ricocheting off a rock and slamming into him. The impact was devastating. He was hit in the left shoulder and the left shoulder blade, but the most gruesome injury was to his face. The bullet had taken out his left eye. Blinded, bleeding, and in shock, Gibbons lay in the field for 3 agonizing hours, unable to move until the cover of darkness allowed for his evacuation. Back at the rear, as the casualty reports began to filter in, a misunderstanding occurred that would inadvertently shape the public perception of the Marine Corps. When the military censor learned of Gibbons's horrific injuries, he assumed the correspondent had died on the field. In a rare suspension of protocol, the censor decided to let Gibbons's final dispatch pass through without a single redaction, an honor never granted to reports describing Army units. The article, raw and unfiltered, was transmitted to the United States. Gibbons had survived, but his posthumous story hit the American breakfast tables with the force of a bombshell. The headlines screamed of the Marines' bravery, describing the hell of the wheat field and the unstoppable advance of the soldiers of the sea. Because the censor had removed the restrictions, the Marines monopolized the front pages. While Army units were fighting just as hard on the flanks, it was the Marines that captured the imagination of the public. This accidental PR coup caused resentment among Army commanders that would last for years, but the narrative was set. The Marines were the spearhead of the American effort. However, the cost of this glory was astronomical. By the time the sun set on June 6th, the 4th Marine Brigade had been decimated. In a single day of fighting, the casualty count stood at 31 officers and 1,056 enlisted men. To put this carnage into perspective, the losses sustained in those few hours exceeded the total combined combat casualties of the United States Marine Corps in its entire 143-year history up to that moment. The sun went down over a field that had been transformed into a graveyard. The golden wheat was trampled and stained. The initial objective, the edge of the woods, had been reached, but the heart of the forest remained in German hands. The attack had been a tactical disaster in terms of formation, yet a strategic victory of morale. The Germans had thrown a wall of lead at the Americans, expecting them to break. Instead, they saw a force that was willing to absorb catastrophic losses and keep coming. The devil dogs had entered the fight, and though they had paid a price in blood that shocked their commanders, they had not stopped. The assault in the wheat field was over, but the nightmare of the woods was just beginning.
In the chaotic tapestry of the First World War, where individual voices were often drowned out by the roar of artillery and the anonymity of mass slaughter, one man's voice rose above the din to define the public perception of the Battle of Belleau Wood. That man was Floyd Gibbons, a correspondent for the Chicago Tribune. He was not merely a civilian observer noting troop movements from the safety of a rear-echelon chateau. He was a participant in the truest sense, a journalist who believed that the only way to document the war was to lie in the dirt alongside the men fighting it. Gibbons was one of only 36 accredited war correspondents on the European theater, a select group tasked with translating the horrors of the Western Front for the American public. However, Gibbons possessed a reckless courage that set him apart. On June 6, 1918, he did not watch the assault on Belleau Wood through binoculars. He went over the top with the waves of Marines, crawling through the wheat field under the same scything machine gun fire that was decimating the ranks of the 4th Brigade. It was in this crucible that Gibbons penned the opening line of a dispatch that would become legendary. Before the blood had even dried on his notebook, he had written, "I entered Belleau Wood with the U.S. Marines." It was a simple sentence, but it carried the weight of history. As Gibbons advanced, he witnessed the gruesome reality of the battle up close. He documented the wounding of a brigade officer near him, recording the man's shock with chilling precision. "My hand is gone. The bullet went into the left elbow, traveled down the bone, tearing the muscles and nerves of the forearm, and lodged in the palm." It was a visceral account of the destruction of the human body, written in real time. But the war was not finished with the storyteller. As Gibbons lay in the field, a German bullet found him. It ricocheted off a rock and struck him with devastating force. The impact was catastrophic. The bullet tore into his left shoulder, shattered his left shoulder blade, and struck him in the face, gouging out his left eye. In his memoirs, Gibbons later described the precise moment of the impact with a haunting sensory clarity. "And they thought we wouldn't fight. The world went white." For 3 hours, the blinded and bleeding journalist lay in the open field, drifting in and out of consciousness, unable to move as the battle raged around him. It was only after the sun set and the cover of darkness descended that he could be evacuated to an aid station. The physical trauma Gibbons suffered was immense, but the impact of his wounding on the narrative of the war was even greater.
When word reached the military sensors at the rear that Floyd Gibbons had been hit, a rumor quickly solidified into an accepted fact. The famous correspondent was dead. Believing they were handling the final work of a fallen hero, the censorship office made an unprecedented decision. They decided to release his last dispatch exactly as it was written, bypassing the strict operational security protocols that typically forbade the naming of specific units in active combat. For the first time in the war, a dispatch was transmitted to the United States uncensored. The article hit the American press like a thunderclap. Across the nation, newspapers splashed Gibbons' story across their front pages. The headline screamed of the heroism of the U.S. Marines. Because the censor had lifted the veil of anonymity, the American public read specifically about the Marines, not American troops or Allied forces, but the Marines. The vivid, bloody descriptions of the fighting, combined with the dramatic story of Gibbons' own death, which he survived, though he lost his eye, created an immediate and powerful mythology. The article galvanized the American home front. The image of the Marines as an unstoppable elite force willing to walk into hell was seared into the national consciousness. However, this PR coup was not without its internal controversies. In the immediate aftermath of the battle, and for years following the war, officers of the U.S. Army expressed deep resentment over the coverage. They argued with some justification that Army units on the flanks had fought with equal bravery and sustained equal terror, yet received none of the glory because Gibbons happened to be embedded with the Marines. They felt the Marine Corps had garnered a disproportionate share of the fame due to a clerical assumption that a journalist had died. Gibbons himself later tried to correct the record. He noted that the Marines and Army units had fought shoulder to shoulder, bleeding into the same French soil. But the momentum of the press was a force of nature that could not be reversed. The story was out. The legend was print. In the eyes of the American public, Belleau Wood was a Marine victory, and the Devil Dogs were the saviors of Paris. Floyd Gibbons, the man who lost an eye to tell the story, had inadvertently built a propaganda machine that turned a tactical bloodbath into a founding myth of the modern Marine Corps.
If the crossing of the wheat field on June 6th had been a slaughter, the entry into the tree line of Belleau Wood was a descent into a claustrophobic nightmare. By the evening of that first bloody day, the Marines had managed to secure only the ragged edge of the forest. They had pierced the perimeter, but the heart of the position, the dark, tangled center in the northern sectors, remained firmly in the grip of the German 237th Division. As the sun vanished, the nature of the war shifted from the open field maneuvering of the afternoon to a primal, intimate brutality that would define the next 48 hours. The fighting that erupted from June 6th to June 8th bore little resemblance to the calculated trench warfare that had defined the Western Front for years. Inside the woods, the battle lines were fluid and confused. Visibility was practically non-existent, reduced to shadows flitting between the trees. The Germans, realizing that their defensive shell had been cracked, launched a series of ferocious counterattacks intended to drive the Americans back into the open fields. What ensued was combat at its most savage. The engagement devolved into a series of desperate close-quarters brawls. In the gloom of the undergrowth, rifles became clubs, and the distance between combatants was measured in inches. Bayonets were fixed and used with grim efficiency, but often there was no room even for that. Men fought with fists, with trench knives, and with rocks. It was a chaotic melee where the veneer of civilized warfare was stripped away completely. It was during these dark days and darker nights that the rumors contributing to the devil dog mystique began to circulate with feverish intensity.
Stories spread along the lines and eventually across the lines to the enemy that in the desperation of the hand-to-hand struggle, Marines had resorted to biting their opponents. While these accounts dwell in the realm of unverified lore, they underscore the sheer ferocity of the combat. To the German soldiers who were accustomed to the weary resignation of European conscripts, this behavior was terrifyingly feral. The German commanders, initially dismissive of the amateur Americans, were forced to rapidly recalibrate their assessment. Major Bischoff, commander of the 461st Regiment, penned a report during this period that stripped away any remaining illusions of superiority. His words were a warning to his superiors. "They fight like animals. I expect no quarter." The phrase, "fight like animals," was not an insult. In the context of Bischoff's report, it was an admission of the enemy's terrifying vitality and lack of fear. On June 9th, the complexion of the battle changed again, shifting from the intimate violence of the bayonet to the industrial erasure of the landscape. The American and French artillery unleashed a bombardment of apocalyptic proportions upon the woods. The objective was to break the German strongpoints that infantry assaults could not dislodge. The effect on the forest was total. The ancient hunting preserve was pulverized. Massive trees were sheared off mid-trunk as if cut by a giant scythe, turning the forest into a jagged wasteland of splintered wood. The artillery fire was so intense and sustained that the very geography of Belleau Wood was rewritten in craters and debris. Yet despite this inferno, the Germans did not break. They suffered horrific casualties, but the survivors simply dug deeper into the ruin, utilizing the craters and the fallen timber to construct new fortifications. The resilience of the German defenders was matched only by the logistical strain placed upon them. German documents recovered later revealed that the intensity of the American pressure was bleeding their supplies dry. The machine gunners of the 237th Division, who had fired incessantly for days, were running out of ammunition. They were holding their ground, but they were reaching a breaking point. For the Marines, the experience was a blur of exhaustion and terror, best characterized by the night agony. When darkness fell over the shattered woods, the war did not stop, it merely changed form. The nights were absolute in their blackness. The trees, split and shattered by the shelling, loomed like jagged spears against the sky. Marines dug shallow foxholes into the mud, often finding themselves digging through the remains of the fallen. Sleep was impossible. German machine guns would chatter sporadically in the dark. Blind fire intended to keep the Americans pinned and psychologically shattered. It was a nightly hunt where death arrived without warning. The human cost of this stalemate was staggering. By dawn on the worst days, units that had attacked with 300 men found themselves with barely 90 effective survivors. The remaining 210 were scattered across the forest floor, entangled in the roots and rocks. By June 14th, the attrition rate had reached a critical threshold. The 4th Marine Brigade had been in continuous combat for over a week. Casualties had soared to 50% of the brigade's combat strength. The physical and mental exhaustion of the men was total. Recognizing that the brigade was in danger of ceasing to exist as a fighting force, General Harbord made the difficult decision to pull the Marines off the line for a brief respite. They were temporarily relieved by the fresh troops of the U.S. Army's 7th Infantry Division. As the Marines stumbled out of the woods, dirty, hollow-eyed, and covered in blood, they left behind a landscape that had been transformed into a charnel house. They had paid a price in blood that exceeded any in their history, and yet the woods were not fully theirs. They had fought like animals and bitten into the German line, but the final victory was yet to be won. The legend was growing, but it was being fed by a river of casualties that showed no sign of stopping. In the midst of the chaos of Belleau Wood, where the modern machinery of war was grinding human beings into dust, the spirit of the United States Marine Corps was not found in a general strategy or a politician's speech. It was embodied in the singular, rugged figure of a non-commissioned officer who was already a living myth before he ever set foot in France. Gunnery Sergeant Daniel Joseph Daly was not merely a soldier. By 1918, he was an institution, a walking testament to the history of the Corps. Daly held a distinction that placed him in a stratospheric tier of military history. He was one of the very few American servicemen to have been awarded the Medal of Honor twice for two completely different combat operations. To the young Marines of the 4th Brigade, many of whom were college athletes or fresh volunteers, Daly was the connection to the old Corps, a warrior who had survived the days of empire and colonial policing to lead them into the industrial age of warfare. His legend had been forged nearly 2 decades prior. The first chapter was written on August 14, 1900, during the Boxer Rebellion in Beijing. As a young private, Daly found himself defending a crucial section of the legation wall. Alone, through the terrifying darkness of a Chinese night, he held his position against repeated waves of attackers. By the time the sun rose, approximately 200 Boxer rebels lay dead before his post. When a relief officer arrived and asked why he had not retreated or called for support, Daly's response was a masterclass in laconic duty. "I was your man." 15 years later, during the United States occupation of Haiti in 1915, Daly earned his second Medal of Honor. During a raid on Fort Liberté on October 24th, he led his squad through a harrowing engagement, once again demonstrating a level of courage that bordered on the supernatural. By the time the Marines arrived in France, the name Dan Daly was whispered in barracks and trenches with a reverence usually reserved for saints or ghosts. He was the standard by which all other Marines measured their worth. On June 6, 1918, during the fateful assault on Belleau Wood, Daly was serving as the gunnery sergeant for the 73rd Machine Gun Company of the 2nd Marine Regiment. The air was thick with steel, and the wheat field was rapidly becoming a killing ground. As the order to advance came down the line, the sheer volume of German fire caused a momentary, paralyzing hesitation among the troops. It was the friction of war, the natural human instinct to hug the earth when the air is filled with death. It was in this precarious moment that Daly cemented his place in immortality. Rising from the safety of the ground, the gray-haired sergeant moved to the center of his unit. He was an older man among boys, a veteran among novices. With a rifle and bayonet swinging over his head, he turned to his pinned-down men. His voice, honed by years of drilling recruits, cut through the roar of artillery and the rattle of Maxim guns. He shouted the words that would become the most famous battle cry in the history of the Marine Corps. "Come on, you sons of bitches, do you want to live forever?" The phrase was electric. It was raw, profane, and utterly inspiring. It stripped away the fear of death by acknowledging it directly, challenging the men to choose between safety and glory. According to later accounts and the humility that defined the man, Daly would admit that his actual words might have been a less colorful, "Come on, damn it." But the version reported by correspondents like Floyd Gibbons captured the true spirit of the moment. It resonated with the fatalistic bravado of the Corps. The quote was instantly immortalized, printed in newspapers, and eventually shouted by generations of recruits on Paris Island. But Daly's legacy at Belleau Wood was defined by more than just a single sentence. It was defined by his philosophy of leadership. Following his heroics in France, and as he approached the end of his career,
Daly was offered twice a commission to become an officer by generals who wished to honor his service. Twice, he refused. His reasoning became another essential part of Marine Corps lore. He reportedly stated, "I prefer to be an outstanding sergeant than just another officer." Other rumors suggest a more direct explanation. "Because I don't want to occupy an officer's desk, I want to lead fighting men." This refusal to leave the enlisted ranks spoke volumes about his character. Daly believed that the soul of the fight was with the men on the ground, not in the command post. He wanted to be where the friction was, where the leadership was physical and immediate. A Marine officer later reflected on the impact of Daly's presence and his legendary cry, writing, "As long as there are guys in the Marine Corps who want to live forever, the spirit of Dan Daly will live among them." The artistic image of that day remains one of the most powerful symbols of the battle. In the middle of a golden wheat field, swept by the invisible scythe of German machine gun fire, a seasoned sergeant stood tall. He was a relic of the Boxers and the Banana Wars, standing amidst the carnage of the Great War. When he shouted, he did not just order men to move. He invited them to transcend their mortality. The young Marines looked at him, at the man who had held the wall in Beijing and stormed the forts in Haiti, and they realized that following him was the only option. They rose from the wheat, many of them to die seconds later, but they moved forward. They went into the hell of the woods because Dan Daly was leading the way.
By late June 1918, the Battle of Belleau Wood had evolved from a tactical engagement into a gruesome test of endurance. For weeks, the forest had consumed men and material at a rate that stunned commanders on both sides. The stalemate had been defined by incremental gains measured in yards of blood-soaked earth, by attacks and counterattacks that left the front lines fluid and confused. However, the final act of this tragedy was set to begin on June 26th, a day that would mark the definitive end of the German presence in the woods. The task of delivering the final blow fell to Major Maurice Scherer. A seasoned officer, Scherer took command of the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marine Regiment, a unit that had already seen the face of hell in the preceding weeks. The strategic objective was clear but daunting: to sweep the remaining German defenders from the northern sector of the woods, a rocky and tangled area where the enemy had dug in with the tenacity of the desperate. Scherer did not go into this final assault alone. The operation was meticulously supported by overwhelming firepower, a lesson learned from the costly frontal assaults earlier in the month. The infantry of the 3rd Battalion was bolstered by 2 companies of the 4th Machine Gun Battalion, providing a base of fire to suppress the enemy heads. Additionally, the 15th Company of the 6th Machine Gun Battalion was attached to the force, ensuring that the Marines brought with them a torrent of lead that could match the German Spandaus. The landscape they entered on that morning bore no resemblance to the hunting preserve that had existed in May. After 25 days of continuous combat and heavy artillery bombardment, Belleau Wood was a ruin. The majestic trees had been sheared off by high explosives, reduced to jagged stumps that looked like broken matchsticks. The ground was a lunar landscape of shell craters and churned mud. The air was heavy with the smell of high explosives and the inescapable stench of decomposing bodies that lay unburied in the thickets. It was a scene of total devastation, a graveyard of nature as much as of men. When the attack commenced, the Marines of the 5th Regiment surged into the northern woods. It was a bloody, claustrophobic affair, fought in the tight confines of the ruined terrain. However, the dynamic of the battle had shifted. The German defenders, battered by weeks of relentless pressure and cut off from effective resupply, began to buckle. The resistance, though still lethal, lacked the cohesive fury of the early June engagements. The Marines pushed forward, clearing the dugouts and rock formations one by one. As the day wore on, the sounds of battle began to recede, replaced by the silence of victory. The northern edge of the woods was finally secured. The 237th Division had been broken. It was in this moment of quiet triumph that Major Maurice Shearer composed one of the most famous dispatches in American military history. He did not write a poetic eulogy for the fallen, nor did he boast of tactical brilliance. He sent a report to brigade headquarters that contained just 6 words, a message of profound simplicity that carried the weight of the entire month-long struggle. Wood's now U.S. Marine Corps entirely. This brief sentence signaled the end of the ordeal. It became an instant symbol of the victory, encapsulating the transition of the ground from a contested hellscape to American territory. But behind the brevity of the report lay a grim psychological reality. Rumors and accounts from the time suggest that when Shearer wrote those words, he was a man drained of emotion. It was said that his blood ran cold, not from fear, but from the sheer magnitude of death he had witnessed. For the survivors, the capture of the woods was less a moment of jubilation and more a moment of exhausted relief. The significance of the victory was immediately recognized by the French allies, who had watched the American performance with a mixture of skepticism and awe. On June 30th, just 4 days after Shearer's final report, General Jean de Goutte, commander of the 6th French Army, issued an official decree that would permanently honor the sacrifice of the Marine Brigade. In a gesture of supreme respect, he ordered that the name Belleau Wood be stricken from official military maps. General de Goutte declared, "Henceforth in all official papers, Belleau Wood shall bear the name Bois de la Brigade de Marine." The wood of the Marine Brigade was now more than a geographic location, it was a monument. Major Shearer's final strike had done more than just clear a sector of the front. It had secured a legacy. The woods were entirely theirs, bought and paid for with a currency of blood that the Marine Corps would never forget. The battle was over, but the memory of what it took to write that final report would endure.
If Gunnery Sergeant Dan Daly represented the enlisted soul of the old Corps, Lieutenant Colonel Albert Wright Catlin was its commanding intellect and its steely officer-class backbone. By the time the 6th Marine Regiment arrived in France, Catlin was already a figure of immense stature, a man whose career mirrored the rise of the United States as a global power. He was not a product of the rapid expansion of 1917. He was a warrior who had been in the service since the 1890s, a veteran whose experience predated the invention of the machine guns that now threatened to annihilate his command. Catlin's resume read like a history of American expeditionary warfare. He had served in the Spanish-American War, witnessing the birth of the American Empire. During the Boxer Rebellion of 1900, he had stood on the walls of the American legation in Beijing, commanding the guard that held back waves of fanatical insurgents. He had fought in the jungles of the Philippines and participated in numerous small wars that defined the Corps' early 20th century existence. By 1918, he had spent nearly 3 decades in uniform, surviving conflicts across the globe without ever sustaining a significant injury. He carried an aura of invincibility, a quiet assurance that he was immune to the hazards of his trade. On June 6, 1918, as the 6th Regiment prepared to assault the dark, fortified tree line of Belleau Wood, Catlin was where he always was, at the front, directing the movement of his battalions. The fighting was confused and heavy, with German artillery and sniper fire raking the American positions. It was in this chaos that Catlin's luck finally ran out. A German sniper, hidden among the dense foliage or rocky outcrops of the woods, spotted the commanding officer. A single shot rang out, and Catlin collapsed. The bullet struck him in the chest, a grave wound that would have killed a lesser man instantly. For the first time in 28 years of active service, the old warhorse was down. The sight of their commander falling sent a shockwave through the nearby troops. The invulnerability of the leadership had been pierced. However, Catlin's response to his own mortality became an instant legend, a story passed down to reinforce the stoicism expected of a Marine officer. As he was being placed on a stretcher, bleeding heavily and gasping for breath, he did not cry out in pain or issue panicked orders. Instead, he looked at the men around him,
young soldiers who were watching their leader being carried away and shouted a line that perfectly encapsulated the grim humor and indomitable spirit of the Corps. "Keep it up," he yelled, his voice struggling against the injury. "I'll just take a short vacation in the hospital." It was a lie, of course. The wound was life-threatening, and his war was effectively over. But it was a magnificent lie. It reassured his men that the mission was bigger than the man, and that even a bullet through the chest was merely an administrative inconvenience, a vacation. Catlin was evacuated to the rear, but his influence remained on the battlefield. The 6th Regiment pressed on, driven by the momentum he had instilled. Catlin survived the wound, though his days of leading infantry assaults were finished. In the aftermath of the war, he turned his attention to documenting the history he had helped create. He penned a memoir that remains a classic of military literature. The title he chose was Quintessential Marine Corps, With the Help of God and a Few Marines. The title itself was a masterstroke of understatement, reflecting a classic Anglo-American optimism and the distinct arrogance of the Corps. It implied that divine intervention was helpful, but the presence of a few Marines was the decisive factor. The book solidified the narrative of Belleau Wood for the American public, framing the battle not just as a strategic victory, but as a moral triumph of the American fighting man. Catlin's heroism and leadership were formally recognized by the nations he fought for. He was a recipient of the Medal of Honor, the highest award for valor in action against an enemy force, cementing his place in the pantheon of American heroes. In addition to his American decorations, the French government, recognizing the vital role he played in saving Paris, bestowed upon him the Croix de Guerre with Palm, indicating a citation at the Army level, and inducted him into the Legion of Honor with the rank of officer. Lieutenant Colonel Albert Catlin was the embodiment of the professional officer corps. He was a man who led from the front, bled with his men, and treated a sniper's bullet as a ticket to a short vacation.
To fully understand the legend of Belleau Wood, one must step out of the American trench and peer through the field glasses of the enemy. For a century, the narrative has been dominated by the American perspective, the story of the devil dogs earning their name through sheer ferocity. But what did the German soldiers of the 237th Division actually see across the wheat fields? Did they truly coin the term that became the Marine Corps' most sacred moniker? Or was the reality of their reaction more complex, grounded in professional respect rather than mythological fear? The official German archives paint a picture that is both flattering and terrifyingly pragmatic. The reports filed by German officers during and immediately after the battle do not speak of supernatural beasts, but of a highly lethal military reality. In the clinical language of military bureaucracy, the intelligence reports regarding the 237th Division sector describe the American adversaries not as dogs, but as soldiers of unexpected quality. One captured report explicitly characterized the Marines as vigorous, self-confident, and remarkable marksmen. This specific observation, remarkable marksmen, was the true source of German anxiety. The German army, accustomed to the massed, erratic fire of conscripted European armies worn down by 4 years of war, was suddenly facing men who aimed. The Marines' ability to deliver effective aimed rifle fire from distances of over 100 yards disrupted German tactics. It was this technical proficiency, combined with an aggressive confidence, that impressed the German High Command far more than any bayonet charge. However, the central pillar of the Marine Corps legend, the claim that the Germans nicknamed them Teufelhunden, withered under historical scrutiny. Extensive searches of German military records, letters, and diaries from the period have yielded a surprising result. There is no direct evidence that the term was ever used by German soldiers in 1918. In 1993, the renowned German historian, Professor Dr. Jürgen Ruhr, addressed this historical anomaly in correspondence with Brigadier General Edwin Simmons, the Marine Corps historian.
Rohr's analysis was linguistically damning. He noted, "I consider that the term Teufelhunden is not common in the German language." He explained that if a German were to construct such a phrase, the grammatical structure would likely be teuflische Hunde, fiendish dogs, but even that would be an incredibly awkward and unnatural expression for a native speaker. This linguistic forensic investigation was supported by earlier observations. As far back as 1919, H.L. Mencken, the famous American journalist and scholar of linguistics, debunked the German origin of the phrase in his book, The American Language. Mencken argued that the Germans, even in the heat of the Great War, did not typically invent derogatory or mythological nicknames for their enemies. He concluded bluntly, Teufelhunden for American Marines was invented by an American correspondent. The Germans never used it. The evidence for an American fabrication becomes even stronger when examining the timeline of the legend. The first known appearance of the term in American print was in the Boston Globe on April 14, 1918. This date is critical. It is fully 6 weeks before the Battle of Belleau Wood began. The fact that the nickname was circulating in American newspapers before the Marines had even engaged in the heavy fighting that supposedly earned them the title suggests that the Devil Dog moniker was a pre-packaged piece of propaganda. It was likely a creation of the American publicity machine, perhaps even originating from General Pershing's staff or a creative recruiter, designed to build a fearsome identity for the troops before they ever fired a shot. Furthermore, the spelling itself betrays a non-German origin. The recruiting posters and newspaper clippings of 1918 proudly displayed the phrase Teufelhunden. To a German speaker, this is a glaring grammatical error. In German, compound nouns are combined, and the genitive connection often requires an S. The correct term would have been Teufelshunde, devil's dogs. The version Teufelhunden, 2 separate words, missing the connector, is a clumsy translation, the kind a non-native speaker or an American propagandist with a dictionary but no grasp of syntax would construct. Yet, if the name was a myth, the fear was real. While they may not have called them devil dogs, the Germans viewed the Marines with a mixture of horror and awe that was perhaps even more profound. The Germans had been told that the Americans were an inexperienced, amateur force that would crumble under the pressure of modern stormtrooper tactics. The reality they faced in the woods shattered this illusion. A report from the commander of the 237th Division, discovered later in the archives, captures the true German assessment of their enemy. It reads, "Their bravery is incredible. They attacked like men who do not fear death. These are not soldiers we know. They are stormtroopers of a new type." This was the genuine German view. They did not see dogs. They saw a new breed of soldier, one who refused to act according to the established rules of survival. The artistic image of the German experience in Belleau Wood is one of profound psychological dislocation. In the trenches and foxholes behind the tree line, German veterans sat in silence, exchanging glances that conveyed more than words. They had expected a turkey shoot against green troops. Instead, they watched waves of Marines emerging from the wheat, walking into machine gun fire without breaking stride. They saw men who, when cut off and surrounded in the dense undergrowth, fought with fists and rocks rather than surrender. To the German soldier, who had spent years fighting enemies that operated with a predictable caution, this behavior bordered on madness. It defied the logic of self-preservation. As the casualty reports piled up and the ammunition ran low, the German defenders came to a chilling conclusion. The enemy across the line was possessed by a reckless, almost devilish audacity. They may not have called them devil dogs, but in the dark, blood-soaked recesses of the woods, they undoubtedly believed they were fighting something that had crawled out of hell. The name may have been American propaganda, but the nightmare it described was a German reality.
As the smoke cleared over the ruined landscape of Belleau Wood in late June 1918,
a new entity emerged from the tree line. It was not just a military unit that had secured a tactical objective. It was a legend that had been christened with a name destined to echo through the ages. The moniker Devil Dogs had taken root, becoming the defining identity of the United States Marine Corps. However, as historians and linguists would later dissect the origins of this ferocious title, a complex duality emerged. The legend of Teufelhunden stands at the intersection of bloody reality and brilliant propaganda, a myth that became true not because of its etymology, but because of the men who adopted it. The critical analysis of the term's origin reveals a story far more nuanced than the accepted lore of a terrified enemy coining the phrase. Brigadier General Edwin Simmons, a renowned historian of the Marine Corps, conducted an exhaustive investigation into the birth of the Devil Dog name. His research peeled back the layers of wartime myth-making to reveal a more domestic origin. Simmons concluded that the term was likely not shouted across the trenches by German soldiers in the heat of battle, but rather percolated within the Marine ranks themselves. He suggested that a few Marines, perhaps influenced by the bravado of the quiet sector period near Verdun between March and May 1918, might have coined the nickname as a badge of honor before the true slaughter even began. Despite these dubious roots, by the time the guns fell silent at Belleau Wood, the nickname was no longer a subject of debate. It was a permanent fixture of the Marine lexicon. The legend had become so powerful, so viscerally appealing to the American public and the Corps itself, that it became impossible to dislodge with mere facts. The narrative that the best soldiers in Europe had named the Marines after the Hounds of Hell was simply too potent to discard. This transformation from rumor to sacred truth was fueled by a relentless American propaganda machine. Throughout 1918, recruitment posters were plastered across the United States featuring a bulldog chasing a dachshund, emblazoned with the slogan, Teufelhunden, German nickname for U.S. Marines. These posters did not just reflect public sentiment, they created it. They actively distributed the myth to young men hungry for glory, cementing the idea that joining the Marines meant becoming a creature of mythic ferocity. However, contemporary observers were already skeptical. The celebrated American journalist and linguist H.L. Mencken, writing in his 1919 seminal work, The American Language, offered a withering critique of the official story. Mencken, with his characteristic cynicism and attention to detail, dismantled the German origin theory. He wrote, "The Germans during the war did not have derogatory nicknames for their enemies. Teufelhunden for American Marines was invented by an American journalist. The Germans never used it." But even Mencken acknowledged the seductive power of the lie, noting that the title was too attractive to reject. Modern historians have largely synthesized these conflicting threads into a cohesive explanation. They argue that the Devil Dog legend was not a singular event, but a convergence of three distinct factors. First, there was the undeniable, raw courage displayed by the Marines in Belleau Wood, a ferocity that gave the lie a foundation of truth. Second, there was the efficiency of the American propaganda apparatus, spearheaded by writers like Floyd Givens, who knew that a colorful nickname was worth more than a dry tactical report. And third, there was the strategic desire of the American command to craft an image of an elite shock force that would intimidate the enemy and inspire the home front. Whatever the academic reality, the internal reality for the Marines on the ground was different. They didn't care about linguistics or the source of the nickname. They cared about what it represented. One Marine officer, reflecting on the era, admitted with refreshing candor, "We didn't know where it came from. We just knew that it sounds good and means that we will not retreat until the enemy is defeated." The legend had taken on its own life. It ceased to be a question of whether a German officer actually said the words. It became a self-fulfilling prophecy. A veteran of Belleau Wood summed up the sentiment that rendered the historical debate irrelevant. "It doesn't matter if the Germans came up with it or we did. That nickname describes what we did there." In the end, the Devil Dog was a creature born of the American imagination, but fleshed out by American sacrifice. It was a propaganda victory that morphed into a spiritual identity. The name might have been invented in a newsroom or a recruitment office, but it was validated in the wheat fields in the dark woods of France. By the time the battle ended, the Marines were no longer just soldiers. They were the devil dogs, and they had the casualties and the victory to prove it. The myth had become history.
When the guns finally fell silent and the smoke drifted away from the ravaged canopy of Belleau Wood, the United States Marine Corps was left holding the ground. They had secured the victory, captured the objective, and birthed the legend that would sustain the organization for a century. However, as the adrenaline of the assault faded, it was replaced by the cold, hard arithmetic of modern war. The bill for the title of Devil Dogs had come due, and the cost was astronomical. The glory of Belleau Wood was not free. It was purchased with a level of sacrifice that was entirely unprecedented in the American experience. To understand the true nature of the battle, one must look past the mythology and stare directly at the numbers. They tell a story of attrition that is difficult to comprehend, even in hindsight. The 4th Marine Brigade entered the sector with a combat strength of approximately 9,500 men, the flower of American youth, confident and eager. Over the course of 25 days of relentless combat, that force was systematically dismantled. The shock began on the very first day of the major assault. On June 6th alone, 1,087 Marines were killed in action. In a span of hours, amidst the wheat fields and the fringes of the forest, the Corps lost more men than it often lost in entire campaigns during the 19th century. But the killing did not stop there. By the time the battle concluded, the ledger of death was staggering. The official statistics reveal the grim toll. 1,811 Americans, Marines, and attached Army personnel were killed in the struggle for the woods. Another 7,966 were wounded, many of them suffering from the horrific injuries characteristic of artillery and machine gun fire, shattered limbs, blindness from gas, and bodies torn apart by shrapnel. When the broader scope of the 6-month operational period is considered, the total casualties reached 11,968. But focusing strictly on the brigade at Belleau Wood, the attrition rate was terrifying. 55% of the initial strength of the 4th Marine Brigade had become casualties. More than half of the men who had marched toward the sound of the guns in May were dead, wounded, or missing by the end of June. The historical magnitude of this slaughter cannot be overstated. A single statistical comparison highlights the watershed nature of Belleau Wood. The casualties sustained by the Marines in this one battle exceeded the total combined casualties of the United States Marine Corps for its entire preceding 143-year history, from the Corps' inception in 1775 through the Revolution, the War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, the Civil War, the Spanish-American War, and the various expeditions of the Banana Wars. All of those losses combined did not equal the blood spilled in this single patch of French forest. General James Harbord, the Army officer who commanded the Marine Brigade with such aggressive tenacity, acknowledged this horrific reality in his post-battle assessment. He wrote, "Casualties in this battle were staggering and unprecedented in Marine Corps history. It was a somber admission that the rules of engagement had changed forever. The era of small skirmishes was over. The era of industrial slaughter had begun." The physical reality of the cost was felt most acutely by the men who survived. One Marine, reflecting on the devastation and the friends he had buried in the shallow mud, offered a chilling geographical observation. "We won Belleau Wood by blood. Every cubic centimeter of this forest is Marine Corps." This was not a metaphor. The soil was literally saturated with the remains of the brigade. The French allies, who had initially doubted the staying power of the American forces, were silenced by this display of sacrifice. They recognized that the Americans had paid the ultimate price to hold the line for Paris. In a gesture of profound gratitude and respect, the French government officially renamed the forest. The maps were redrawn, and the Bois de Belleau became the Bois de la Brigade des Marines, Wood of the Marine Brigade. It was a rare honor and acknowledgement that the land now belonged to the men who had died for it. Yet even amidst the accolades and the renaming ceremonies, a lingering question haunted the survivors. Was the price fair? Was capturing a square mile of shattered timber worth 25 days of hell and the destruction of a generation of young men? Tactical debates would rage for years about whether the woods could have been bypassed or neutralized by artillery alone. But for the Marines, the calculation was different. They had been asked to hold the line, and they held. They had been asked to attack, and they attacked. The price was paid without negotiation. The statistics of Belleau Wood serve as the grim receipt for the Marine Corps' entry onto the world stage, a receipt written in numbers that are as shocking today as they were in 1918.
When the armistice was signed in November 1918 and the guns of the Great War finally fell silent, the physical battle for Belleau Wood had long since ended. However, the battle for the memory and meaning of the conflict was just beginning. The legend of the Devil Dogs did not fade away with the demobilization of the troops. Instead, it was carefully cultivated, expanded, and institutionalized until it became the bedrock of the Marine Corps' identity in the 20th century. What began as a dubious linguistic curiosity or piece of wartime propaganda was transformed into a sacred title that would define the Corps for generations. In the immediate aftermath of the war, the image of the Devil Dog was aggressively leveraged by the Marine Corps recruiting apparatus. Despite the historical questions surrounding the term's origin, whether it was truly spoken by terrified Germans or invented by American journalists, the Corps embraced the moniker without hesitation. Throughout 1918 and into the post-war years, recruiting posters featured vivid imagery that cemented the association. The most iconic of these depicted a bulldog wearing a Marine helmet chasing a fleeing dachshund representing Germany. The captions often read, "Teufelhunden," proudly displaying the grammatically incorrect German phrase as a badge of honor. The recruiting strategy was simple and effective. If you wanted to be part of the force that the enemy feared most, you joined the Marines. The accuracy of the nickname mattered far less than its utility. As the decades passed, the legend evolved from a recruiting slogan into a cultural phenomenon. By the 1950s and 1960s, the Devil Dog mythology was reinforced and amplified through the lens of American pop culture. Hollywood films and documentaries recounting the heroism of World War I brought the story of Belleau Wood to a new audience. The gritty reality of 1918 was polished into a cinematic narrative of unstoppable courage. Simultaneously, the Marine Corps institutionalized the legend within its own training structures. The story of Belleau Wood became a standard part of the curriculum at boot camp. New recruits, standing on the yellow footprints at Paris Island or San Diego, were taught that they were inheriting the mantle of the Devil Dogs. The phrase became part of a sacred triad of Marine existence: tradition, honor, Corps. This institutionalization went beyond training. It became a fraternal bond. Veteran organizations, such as the Military Order of the Devil Dogs, were formed, creating a subculture within the veteran community dedicated to preserving the history and camaraderie born in the French woods. To be a Devil Dog was to belong to an exclusive order of warriors who had been tested and found worthy. However, the construction of this myth was not without its detractors or inter-service tensions. The narrative dominance of the Marine Corps in the aftermath of the war was a source of significant irritation for the United States Army. General John J. Pershing, the commander of the American Expeditionary Forces, was reportedly annoyed by the disproportionate amount of glory the Marines received. From the Army's perspective, their divisions, fighting on the flanks of the Marines and in other sectors, had engaged in combat just as grueling and sustained casualties just as heavy, yet they lacked the flashy nickname and the PR machine driven by correspondents like Floyd Gibbons. The Devil Dog story, in the eyes of some Army officers, overshadowed the collective effort of the American military. Yet even Pershing eventually bowed to the reality of what the Marines had accomplished. Despite his frustrations with the publicity, he offered a tribute that validated the core of the myth. He admitted, "The Marines have shown that the American can go with the best armies of Europe and not only survive, but win." This acknowledgement from the highest levels of command proved that while the nickname might have been a point of contention, the performance it represented was undeniable. Over time, the meaning of the term shifted. It ceased to be defined by the enemy's fear and began to be defined by the Marines' own self-perception. A historian of the Marine Corps captured this evolution perfectly. Devil Dogs is no longer a nickname that enemies gave us, it is our name that we gave ourselves because we know who we are.
The guns of June 1918 have been silent for more than a century, yet the reverberations of the Battle of Belleau Wood continue to shape the American military consciousness today. In the grand tapestry of the Great War, the engagement might appear as a relatively small tactical event, a fight for a single square mile of hunting preserve in a conflict that spanned continents. However, its significance transcends geography and strategy. Belleau Wood was the crucible in which the United States Marine Corps was spiritually reborn, and the moment America began to visualize itself not merely as a participant in world affairs, but as a dominant military power capable of standing toe-to-toe with the finest armies on earth. The legacy of Belleau Wood is rooted in the revelation of American competence. Before this battle, the United States was viewed by European powers with a mixture of hope and skepticism, a nation of vast industrial potential but untested martial resolve. The Marines shattered that skepticism. The battle demonstrated that young American soldiers, when properly trained and motivated, could compete with the German Imperial Army, a force widely considered the most efficient and lethal war machine of the era. The impact of this realization was felt on both sides of the trenches. Even General Erich Ludendorff, the architect of the German war effort, would later admit in his memoirs that the arrival of mass American forces, energetic, aggressive, and unyielding, was a decisive factor in the ultimate defeat of Germany. The Marines at Belleau Wood were the vanguard of this new reality. For the Marine Corps itself, the battle was the genesis of its modern identity. The acquisition of the reputation as devil dogs provided the Corps with an image of elite invincibility that it has guarded jealously ever since. It established a standard of conduct, the idea that a Marine does not surrender, does not retreat, and does not hesitate. This reputation became a self-sustaining prophecy. In the decades that followed, from the islands of the Pacific to the deserts of the Middle East, the shadow of Belleau Wood loomed large. Every Marine was expected to live up to the myth born in the French wheat fields. Crucially, the legacy of the devil dogs illustrates a profound truth about military history. Symbolism is often more powerful than the dry facts of the battlefield. In 1918, American society was desperate for heroes. They needed a narrative of strength to justify the sacrifice of their sons. The Marines provided that narrative. The image of the devil dog, fearless, relentless, and wild, became the avatar of American resolve. Whether the nickname was a German invention or a masterpiece of American propaganda matters little in the final analysis. It became true because the Marines lived it. It became true because it provided a language to describe the indescribable courage required to walk into machine gun fire. Today, the term devil dog has evolved beyond its origins. It is no longer defined by the specific events of June 1918, but stands as a timeless definition of the Marine ethos. As modern Marine doctrine suggests, the title is an eternal symbol of courage, fidelity, and the readiness to march into hell for the defense of one's country. It serves as a reminder that the Corps is a breed apart, an organization where the collective spirit outweighs individual survival. A century has passed since that fateful June. The landscape of northern France has healed. The wheat fields that were once stained red are golden again under the summer sun. The forest of Belleau Wood, once reduced to a lunarscape of splintered stumps and shell craters, has regrown. The trees stand tall and the grass is green, masking the scars of the earth. But in the memory, in the traditions, and in the very bones of the United States Marine Corps, June 1918 remains frozen in time. The legacy survives in the image of those young men who refused to fear death. It survives in the echo of Gunnery Sergeant Dan Daly's immortal question, "Do you want to live forever?" The answer, forged in the fire of Belleau Wood and carried by every generation of Marines since, remains the same: no. They do not want to live forever. They want to live with honor. They want to live with the fighting spirit that refuses to break. This spirit, born in the hell of a shattered forest, lives on in every Marine who shouts the motto Semper Fidelis, always faithful. The legend of the Devil Dogs is not just a story of the past. It is the heartbeat
of the future.